Agenda item number 6 is matters from the city manager. And this evening, we're going to have a discussion regarding the baseline data from the Energy Roundtable.
So this is a continuation of our meeting right before the study session last week, and Jonathan Cohen will be making his presentation. Maybe.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm going to stall a little bit as the presentation comes up, and it was interesting listening to the previous conversation. I was going to say we're really shifting gears to energy now, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Jeff has really tried to encourage me to relax our climate change efforts. That way we wouldn't have to deal with snow in the future. So, but he left, and so he didn't get that. So let me just, should be loaded up.
I think you need to work on that a little bit, the timing.
I'm not a comedian.
No, I think, yeah, I know. So I think you need to be careful in that area.
Is that like keep your day job?
Yeah,
I
really.
told you I was stalling.
Okay.
No, I don't see it loaded up. What's going on?
We did, but I didn't.
Probably where she put it.
Did you see?
Yep, there.
There you go.
Oh, sorry. With me for just a second. Okay, there we go. So, as Jay mentioned, this is a continuation of a conversation that we started a few weeks ago, and I think we really were able to get into a fair amount of the conversation at last week's Energy Roundtable. On September 14th, you were provided a first draft of the baseline data and analysis, and to understand what we started with, it really was reaching out to stakeholders, and council members, of course, provided some input as well, but it was really a laundry list of the types of data that we felt we really needed to start gathering to help frame and guide how we would pursue developing our objectives and doing the analysis necessary to develop the pathways forward. And what we determined is that we really had not spent the time thinking about how we were sequencing that data and really thinking what do we need to know and when do we need to know it. I think those are very critical questions that helped us really refine the strategy and the data that you were provided this past Friday. And I do have copies if you need those.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Too much paper to remember to bring.
So as we started thinking about this concept of really the data, we had several of the stakeholder meetings that we reported out to council at last week's Energy Roundtable meeting. And as we started to pour over the requests and the ideas and enhancements to the data, it really led us to think about who currently has the data. In other words, where do we go to get it? How do we actually develop a process by which we obtain that data? And then a really critical piece is how do we use it? So once we get information, it's really important for us to be thinking about the difference between just getting information and then taking that information and analyzing it in a way that gives us guidance on how we're going to pursue the various plans and the various objectives in the energy plan. So that's something that we have really been able to refine our thinking, again, to define what falls into the bucket of actual information, and then how do we build upon that foundation to do the analysis necessary. And then we want to begin a conversation with council at next week's Energy Roundtable meeting to begin framing and defining the project's objectives. So we've not had the conversation yet about what's the vision of the Energy Future Plan, and how do we start to identify the objectives that support that vision. What I mean by that is during the stakeholder meetings we have heard a lot of comments about long-term rate stability, being able to predict our rates, more access to clean energy, the ability to have more control at the local level. Those are all great objectives, but I think we need to think about what's the vision and then how do those objectives support that vision. So again, as we start to gather the data, it's important for us to understand what are we gathering to guide that process forward. So in the packet that I just passed out, we packaged the data request and the data needs in a little different way in this next iteration. First, we want to understand, really taking a snapshot of where we are today. What's our existing condition? So then we can start to test assumptions and do analysis that allows us to test against where we are currently and where our trajectory is expected to go under our current scenario. So just some questions here that we feel are important to answer. First, how much electricity does Boulder currently use? So things that we would want to drop into this category are average base load, our daily load curve, average peak demand, and these are on the paper that I passed around also. And then of course, what are the highs and lows of our daily peaks? Second, where does that electricity come from? We've talked previously about our electricity portfolio and how we actually categorize the carbon intensity of that portfolio based on a regional and statewide grid. Well, if you recall past conversations, we would like to refine that analysis and really understand what our local portfolio looks like. How are residents net metering? Is there actually a backflow of clean electrons flowing on the grid? How are we categorizing our hydroelectric power? And really getting a clear snapshot of what our portfolio looks like at the local level in comparison to a regional and statewide portfolio. That's not information that we currently have, or it's not an analysis that we've done. Third, it's really critically important to understand the realistic projections for our electricity needs. This goes to the question about our planning horizon. Are we thinking about a short-term project that looks at an energy future of 10 years, 20 years, 50 years? It's a conversation that we'd like to start framing, and again, having that basal level of understanding is really going to help us develop the vision and the planning horizon. So what is the projected growth in base load and demand by sector, residential, commercial, and industrial? What are the realistic projections and penetration of our demand side programs? So as we start to see our load, how can our programs under the Climate Action Plan start to reduce that load so we can see what we actually are working with regards to our load profile? What role does distributed generation play at the local level? In other words, what's the maximum amount of distributed generation, solar photovoltaic panels on rooftops, for example? What's the maximum amount that we could actually have inside city limits, the theoretic limit, the real limit, and how do we map that and cluster that? And if you recall, we talked about that a little bit at the last Energy Roundtable. And then how does our portfolio change based on factors such as rebates, technologies? What about potential changes in load due to electric vehicles? We're having that conversation right now. So these are things that we need to start understanding and get a real clear handle so we can start testing assumptions. Fourth, and I just have a few more slides. It's important to understand as we talk about the business as usual scenario, how will our generation shift in the next 10 or 20 years based on current policies and programs? So the state renewable portfolio standard, for example, House Bill 1365, the Clean Air, Clean Jobs, Comanche 3 coming online. Those are things that we know right now, and we're going to have to assume that, for example, the RPS is going to be met in 2020. We need to agree on some assumptions so then we can build on that. And of course, besides just emissions, it's critically important that we begin projecting rate increases for that planning horizon the next 10 or 20 years. We have some good information coming in now from some recent PUC dockets that indicate that rates are expected to rise 30% in the next 10 years. Well, that's a significant issue for all sectors of Boulder's population. So how can we be thinking now about, if that's the base case, how do we start to influence that long-term rate projection? So we also categorized in the information that you provided some some discussion points around municipalization. Now, I'd like to make clear, at least for those that are watching, that municipalization may be a means to an outcome. Again, as we start having a more sophisticated conversation as a work group around what are the objectives and what's the vision of this project, I think we'll recognize that municipalization may be one of the pathways that could get us there. It is not, of course, the objective by itself. That said, there is a strong indication that we can do some analysis now to be able to have a thoughtful conversation when we come back together in November about, December 2nd, about the pathways moving forward. So in your packet, we've identified about 5 different areas that we feel that we could begin doing analysis. So I'll just go through these very quickly. Again, items such as getting good cost estimates, including the legal proceedings for municipalization process, an independent analysis of our previous municipalization studies. So that was our 2005 and 2007 RWBEC studies. We can take a look back and say what part of those studies are good, which parts may need to be updated, and where are there potential holes. Also, getting a very clear understanding of the details of the process, so the arbitration process, understanding previous FERC rulings and severance, the severance process, and technical data that we will need regardless of what path we choose. So that leads to the previous slide about technical data. So getting a clearer understanding of our field and circuit, inventory maps, equipment information, and all of that was included in that September 14th list of data needs. So we are not doing away with those pieces of data. We are sequencing them now and building upon what we need to know first, what we need to know second, in order to make the process flow. Now, we've also spoken to council previously that a lot of the data that we're in need of is currently held by Xcel, our utility. So we do need to make a request to Xcel for that data. Now, I won't go through these, but this is pulled directly from that September 14th list, and it also has a few additional pieces. This is in your packet as well. Just gives you a sense of the type of information that we don't have access to currently, and we need to go to Xcel in order to make that request. Tom is going to talk in just a few moments about the process and timeline to make that request to Xcel. Finally, one of the things we'd like to start doing is identifying, not only do we need to start thinking where we get the data, who currently has it, but what are the processes that we need to put in place to begin analyzing that data? One of the ideas that we've vetted with some of our technical experts is the development of a pro forma or a planning tool that allows us to model and test the assumptions. So we can plug in our base case scenario, where we are today, where we're projected to go under our existing conditions and the things that we know. And it allows us to test different models. For example, plugging in a least cost scenario, optimization of distributed generation, maximum clean energy sources, and the potential impact of legislative regulatory changes. These are just examples of the ways we could use the tool. But what we'd like to do in this phase 1 is develop a scope of work in the very near future, working with our technical experts to develop a scope of work and try to hire a consultant to begin building this tool so we can start to plug and play and see how our assumptions impact our pathways as they start to crystallize a little bit more. So I'd like to turn it over to Tom. He can talk a little bit about the request to Xcel, and then we can come back to council for discussion.
Thanks, Jonathan. We have a limited ability to get information from a private company. You may remember back in 2005, before the RWBEC study, the city made a data request, Frank Bruno did, in March of 2005, based on rights under the franchise agreement. There's 2 provisions in the franchise agreement that relate to information from Xcel. Article 6, which is basically an annual report provision, says by May 1st they have to give us certain financial information. Xcel refused to provide any information under Article 6, saying it's just limited to financial information that was due by May 1st. The second one is Article 14, which is the information necessary for the city to purchase utility assets. The city requested that information, as I said, in March of 2005. Excel's first response was that provision is only triggered if the city elects to purchase the assets or elects to municipalize. I went through all of the files I can find in my office. There's no other documentation about that assertion. However, Excel did subsequently respond to 2 different data requests from the city, providing a significant amount of data. And then Jonathan has reviewed that data and finds some of it helpful, but all of it out of date. So we are currently covered by the franchise agreement till the end of the year. You will recall that we issued a revocable permit to Excel effective, I believe, August 3rd, that extended the franchise by consent through the end of the year. So our rights under the agreement, as it's written currently, would expire at the end of the year, pending us doing something else, like a license of some sort, which is what we're contemplating. So my recommendation is that we make the requests that Jonathan has outlined to Excel as soon as possible, so that we can have those rights while we still have the franchise agreement in place. I assume that they will assert a defense. My guess is the last time, and this is just a guess because I said there's no documentation that I can find, is that they decided they didn't want to push the city into making an election and municipalize, and so they cooperated. I don't know how they'll do it then. The factors were different. They were hoping to be keeping the city's good graces at the time to renegotiate the franchise as well. One of the flaws in the R.W. Beck report, you'll recall, is that Excel delayed so long in giving the data to the city. The R.W. Beck report in 2005 was based on assumptions and not real data. So one of the things that we've all been working on is how do we, if we're going to go, as we go forward in this process, no matter what the ultimate outcome, how do we make these decisions based on real data? So we've all been working on how we go forward, and our part of it is there's an agreement. We can ask for this data under the agreement. They've in fact provided data under those provisions in the past twice. There were 2 separate responses. So I can't promise what they'll do today, only they know, but we want to get that request out sooner rather than later.
Second?
I think it does. So just concluding, I would, I guess, like to acknowledge that Matt had some thoughts about how we want to be, how we should have a more thoughtful conversation about what are the data requests and how do we use the data, and again, what's the time frame. So hopefully the information that we provided to you on Friday and that you have in front of you gives you a better sense of how we're starting to categorize and identify the process to actually do the data analysis moving forward. So Mayor, I think that concludes my presentation.
So why don't we have a discussion on this and kind of see where we are? So Ken?
I think it's you've got a great set of issues and questions and topics that need to be covered, so I certainly support that. A couple of additional items. One would be the seasonality of our load, which kind of works into each of the, the max load, the min, the average, all of that. So there's a seasonality factor. And then the power factor, which is a pretty important issue in determining what our real energy needs are. For those that don't know, power factor is the ratio of real to apparent power. If you have a lot of older computers or even new ones that aren't Energy Star, they have a low power factor, which means they're pretty inefficient at what they require from the grid, and so we might be actually worse off than other cities with respect to power factor, so that would be very important to know for our future. And then, so those are the 2 data comments. The only other comment is getting data from a large monopoly is not easy. This is what I did for 10 years as a career in the telecom business, trying to get good data out of the monopoly telecom providers. It is very, very tough. when they don't want to give it. When they want to give it, you get it. When they don't want to give it, it's difficult, and that was one of my issues that I have harped on before, and we'll see what XL wants to do here. I have no idea, but if they don't want to give it, it will be court battles, and then many steps of court battles. I've been there, so I can tell you war stories later. I won't bore you now.
So I guess I'd like to say that I'm not comfortable with the baseline data yet, and it's partly because
With the what?
with the baseline data that's laid out for us, and I very much wanted to write something, and I couldn't formulate what my problem was. I realized that I think that the scenario notion and those 4 different categories are something that I think that's helpful to me. Because I think you have to flesh those out before you can figure out what the data is you need. Because to me, some of the data, the municipalization stuff is the one that's maybe the easiest to talk about for me, because I did go to the talk by the city manager from Winter Park, Florida, and at the point where they went to the citizens, there were some steps, and they didn't have the complete picture when they went to a citizen vote initially. They had some much more basic information, and there was a kind of touch-in point that asked if people, and I don't know, there were quite a few of us there, maybe some of you remember it better than I do, but that there was like a point where you had sufficient data to see the picture and to have the path laid out, but it was time to go to the citizens and ask if it was at a point to go forward. And it looked to me that some of this is, absolutely, if you were going to municipalize, you'd need to know all of this. But there probably is a place that's pulled back a little bit from there that would be a check-in point if municipalization appears to be an option that we want to pursue. And then in the other, if I can think in terms of scenarios or defining a real objective, it seems to me that's where you start, and then you back into what's the data. It's not spending a lot of time thinking about all the data you'd like to have and then coming up with scenarios. Maybe it looks like Matt wants to talk, so maybe he can be more articulate than I am. But there's something that just feels like it's missing for me, and it may be in part that from my perspective, I would love to be at some decision point by, say, August of 2011, which I know is really soon, and I know it's really not the go, no-go, or we're going to take this route or that route, but that there's something that this council, with these people who have learned and gone through all of this, there is maybe something that can happen at a point in time that isn't 3 years from now, but that is closer, where we eliminate some possibilities, where we begin to focus and hone on other possibilities. Not said very well, but Matt?
No, and Susan, I mostly agree with you all. I need to add a couple of points, maybe from a slightly different perspective, but you said kind of what I was going to say, which is why I wanted this discussion. I always get worried. We could ask for, of course, infinite amounts of data and do infinite analysis. The question is it helping us us and the community come to any decision? So I really like the scenarios. That's exactly what we need. There's no question about that. That was kind of the missing piece of the puzzle for me, because, the data itself, how are people really going to relate to that? Most people can't very well. But what? I guess I step back and I say, so what are the possible outcomes here? Well, there are only a few. There's kind of doing a franchise with Excel or not doing a franchise with Excel, which the only way you could do that is some flavor of municipalization. And with Excel, I suppose you could kind of do a plain vanilla re-up, or you could imagine a franchise that has some different characteristics as we were trying to get to and didn't quite get there. So you define a set of characteristics, even though you don't know for sure you'll get them. And then you'd kind of have to, in terms of talking to citizens, you'd kind of have to weigh, well, if we went this way, here's kind of what we'd see in terms of cost, long-term, energy portfolio. If we went this way, here's what we'd see. If we went this way, here's kind of what we'd see. So up until there, I agree with you. The place where I'm not sure what to say, because it gets us into the never-ending, how detailed analysis do you need, is given that one of those potential choices is municipalization. And given that if we did ask our voters about it, you can be pretty sure that, the incumbent power provider would go all out to try to demonstrate how that's a bad choice and it's going to cost a huge amount of money and so on and so on. You have to be able to respond. And you can only respond if you have some decent data to respond with. That's where I kind of get stuck, and I don't know how far we have to go. But, if Excel were to come in and say, well, their analysis is if we municipalized, just make this up, everybody's rates would double in 5 years, we have to say more than, gee, we don't think so. Right? And we have to base it on something. Yeah, there's going to be some guesswork, of course. We're never going to have perfect data, and we're not going to have a perfect crystal ball either. But we have to have done some analysis that makes it credible. So I'm a little stuck, and I really am looking to you. On the one hand, I don't want to go into the abyss of every piece of data anybody's ever asked for we get, because wouldn't it be cool if we just knew X? But on the other hand, we have to know enough to make a coherent, credible case for all the scenarios to our citizens. That's tricky. That's why I wanted this discussion, not because I had brilliant ideas about what the data was. I don't have brilliant ideas. Just because I wanted to raise that issue, and I think we need some kind of iterative process where you come back to us and say, here's how we're kind of resolving those problems, because we don't have the time or the money to get all the data that we could ever possibly imagine getting. And I wouldn't hold my breath on Excel necessarily handing over all the information we want in the timely manner that we need it. It's not, again, not a comment on Excel. This is going to be a difficult process. And so I think that's the juggling act you've got. That's really why I wanted this discussion. Folks who have some expertise on this, I think it's also great that we get this out to the public so people can see it and say, well, yeah, you don't really need that. I would trade that for this. That could be very helpful to you and to us in the end. Anyway, so I agree with you, Susan. I just am a little concerned that even going to ask the voters about should we proceed, we're going to have a pretty credible case. And I can't define it, but that's the sticking point.
So Susie, Crystal Macon?
I certainly agree we have to have a credible case. What I'm struggling with a bit is that this appears to be very much focused on municipalization. Basic information that we will need regardless, or if we can get it, and then the data for a potential municipalization. I don't see a discussion here about data that we might need, or analyses, or other kinds of changes that we might need if we're talking about some kind of new contract, new negotiations with Excel. And so that's more challenging. Again, we're dealing with Excel, but on the other hand, if Excel looks at this and says, we know where they're headed, and there's no suggestion here that they're really going to gather data about some kind of new negotiation with us, and here are the pieces that they would be most interested in seeing, I wonder whether they will be more receptive if there is a clearer perception that we really are looking at more than one path. I'm just going to say straight out, one of my concerns all along has been that really we're not. We're really focusing on one path. So I think if we are focusing on one path, if that's really where we are,
then we need to say that. If we are focusing on multiple paths, then we have to be credible about gathering data that allows people to analyze another option. And the other most obvious option is what Matt has just identified, which is some hybrid, some different kind of a relationship with Excel. But I don't see that laid out here. I don't see the kind of questioning that you, or things that you would ask, or what you would go after, what kind of changes we might have to go after at the state legislature, what that might look like, how difficult that would be. That's the part that makes me uncomfortable. It feels like we're already setting up what the outcome will be by the data we're asking for.
So, Jonathan, I mean, that's exactly right. Could you go back a slide to the scenarios? So, here's the question in a nutshell. So we're all, since it doesn't say on the slide, were all those scenarios meant to presume some flavor of municipalization, or were those scenarios really, gee, you could get there via municipalization, or you could get there via some sort of franchise agreement?
So I answer the question this way. There was no predetermined outcome at all. And I hear loud and clear that what you were provided doesn't really lay out an analysis for the other potential options.
It doesn't.
I think that that's a really great point. Interestingly, what we have been driving towards is trying to figure out what data we need that we don't have. We have a lot of the data that speaks to what's the process for community choice aggregation, what's the process for retail wheeling or feed-in tariffs. We've done a lot of that already. It's just not included in this document. And I think you bring up a very good point that we need to message this in a way that shows that we don't have a predetermined outcome. What we are trying to do, again, is thinking about the fact that we had set up our next conversation to really lay out the pathways and really say there are really two viable pathways. One is municipalization, the other is live with Excel via a franchise or some hybridization of the white bread or whatever we call it, franchise. What we recognize is that between now and December, when we scheduled that conversation, we could start to gather some of this information that we feel like we need to have in order to make informed decisions. And I think maybe we're not going about it in a way that is broad enough. So we should now think about what are the other pieces that we should be analyzing and pulling those back in. Frankly, we've not had the conversation about what a future franchise might look like. What are the pieces that we need to put in place now? And it's not data. I don't believe personally, and I need to think about this more, but I don't believe that there's additional data we need to gather around that pathway, but we should begin phrasing or framing the conversation around some analysis or thinking about what that franchise might look like. What didn't we get to in this package, and how might we change that in a subsequent package? Should we do some analysis, for example, about the duration of a franchise? We've heard subsequent information that 20 years isn't a legal requirement. Excel has that ability to do shorter franchises. So I think what I hear you saying, and I'm agreeing with, is that we need to start spreading it wider and thinking about all of those options and all of the data needs and analysis that goes with those pieces.
Well, since those are the two primary, at least unless somebody articulates a third,
Well,
that is,
well,
and there are some others that we
There's a
could.
very basic third. There's kind of the baseline case, which is the franchise that Excel said they would sign. I mean, this has to be compared against something.
Well, that could always be the.
Well, no, but I
comparative
think
piece.
but to do the comparison, they have to come up with, here are the costs involved in that, the community costs involved in that too. I mean, you have to compare this against something. You can't compare it against nothingness. But you can say, municipalization will cost you X. Well, what is continuing your current world going to cost you?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great suggestion. And I guess the only point I wanted to make is, it is, to me, critical what people see and what it communicates to them. And if this document were handed out, it communicates that we're on a path, at least to me, that we're on a path to municipalization. Because it doesn't even talk about another franchise, and it doesn't talk about what we had in front of us. If you wanted to go back to what was existing, and then what would we really want if we could get a different kind of agreement with Excel. They're not here. And that, to me, is a big mistake at this point.
So,
Could we
so
hear
the
from
stack,
David?
oh,
yes,
David?
I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Well, I think it's a great point, because I think, in my perspective, all the questions except for what's listed on the municipalization set of questions has everything to do with the potential of renewing a franchise with Excel, because it's really about what does the world look like and what's our best analysis of that, a full implementation of what the path we're on, which is Excel's commitment to HB 1365, the 30% renewable portfolio standard that Excel's committed to at the state level, complete implementation of our CAP programs. We don't really know, in terms of the basis for a franchise discussion, I think one of the challenges we had is we don't know what that looks like 10 years, 20 years from now in terms of rate structures and greenhouse gas emissions. And so to me, that's the critical starting point, that we feel we want to start that analysis, because that is then the basis by which we say, well, what if we enter an agreement to build a 30 megawatt solar facility and it costs X? What does that look like 20 years from now compared to that baseline?
That's exactly right.
So to me, and I think it's an important point about how we present those questions, because those questions to me are completely separate from the question of municipalization. Those, and then there's going to be additional costs if we say, well, can we get Excel to agree to our ideal path B? Or does that require that then we pursue legislative change, or we pursue municipalization, and what are the cost impacts of that? So,
And assuming there are data that we want from Excel about this new path, again, we've got a franchise that expires on December 31st,
Yeah,
so we need to be
yeah.
asking those kinds of
Yeah.
questions of them as well, which also, in my mind, sends a signal that we are still thinking about that,
Yeah.
as opposed to we're only asking questions that send us in another direction.
well, I think a lot of the things that Jonathan had, or the data request to Excel, had actually a lot to do with the first set of questions, the sort of baseline, what does the world look like if we go down the path we're on?
That's
And then there are some additional ones that, if we want to have municipalization discussion as part of looking at options, there are some data requests that we need to make to inform that discussion. But I do think that a lot of what's on that list in terms of daily load, other things you'll see are what we need to answer that first set of questions of what does the world look like on the path we're on. And that's what I would consider the baseline, just sort of full implementation of the things that are already on the table.
Crystal, Macon, Lisa?
Yeah, I think Susie really hit on a good point. Well, first of all, I do want to say, it's much more understandable the way you started organizing the data here and laying out the questions and why you needed some of that information. So I wanted to say that. Yeah, and some of my concerns were exactly like Susie's. So if you put something out, I mean, I look at it as, so we've got the franchise that Excel was willing to sign. We've got that we rejected. I mean, at least the majority of us didn't put it on the ballot. And then I can see 2 or 3 different other models meeting some of these other needs. And I think if we're going to put out a document like that, maybe we have a work session and we start articulating some of that. And I'd say we put our optimum on, and I like the idea of analyzing the length of time, because that was a big hang-up for a lot of people in the community, at least people that I've gotten feedback from, is why would you sign something for 20 years in this fluid energy environment, especially when there could be other regulatory issues. I mean, one of the notes I had is feed-in tariff, and, you know, I went to a talk on how that's just really kicked up the renewables for Europe. I mean, Portugal is going to be at 50% renewable. I mean, Portugal, Spain, countries that you wouldn't necessarily think, but they're going to hit those marks first. And I don't know what people are doing in the, you know, around the state on that one issue.
Macon and then Lisa?
What we needed and what we didn't have to make an intelligent choice with respect to the franchise is a transparent side-by-side comparison of the value and the costs associated with the franchise versus some other. We didn't have it done for some other. And I look at that as the overriding goal, to during this period of investigation, whether it's 1 year or 2, we want that transparent side-by-side comparison. The way in which I have been thinking of this is in 3 ways. The franchise, some version of the franchise, number 2, municipalization, and a third way, which in my mind, I think of it as community choice aggregation. Just to pause for a second, anybody who is a gas customer of Excel's in Boulder can buy their gas elsewhere. They pay a distribution charge to have that gas delivered here. Now, obviously, with the third way, there are some legislative impediments, but that's just one of the obstacles that we put down, because if we choose that way, we'll have probably at least a legislative session where we can see if this is, if
it's viable.
the package we need is going to be able to make its way through the legislation. So I've been thinking of these as the third way, some variant of community choice aggregation. Secondly, municipalization, and then first, the franchise or some variant thereof. Interestingly, we will be in a way better position to negotiate a variant of the franchise. I mean, we know what Excel has offered us to negotiate a variant of that when we have used a disciplined approach to determining what the costs and benefits are of these other 2 ways. Now, we have to do this with a good set of assumptions, because I think as surely as night follows day, even though we make a vigorous push for the data from Excel that Jonathan outlined, and we certainly should, surely as night follows day, we're not going to get it within the time frame that we need. And so we have to develop a good set of assumptions. I remember that when Charles McGlashan was in town in May from Marin Energy, they had exactly the same problem. PG&E wouldn't tell them what their load looked like, what the shape of it was, what the seasonal variations were, and all of that. And so in the third way, I actually see us able to find some really valuable data about the cost of electricity from other sources, using even some of the, I think they used Shell's, a subsidiary of Shell, to tell them what the cost would be like to go out in the market and get a bid for this load that they anticipated they have. Now, and they did this also at the same time that they had a Navigant study that they paid $80,000 for, which in studying the market showed them that they could go up to 50% renewables in the generation of their electricity with no premium at all. That was an important, it gave them encouragement to spend the money and the time to look at these other options with some discipline. Now, one of the studies, and then I'll be done, that I think is necessary in analyzing any of these 3 possibilities, franchise, municipalization, or the third way, is to disaggregate the costs of generation, transmission, distribution, and then administrative and overhead. They have an advantage in California that we're completely lacking in Colorado, which is that their regulatory authority already made P&G, part of their bills already established what the different cutouts were for the different components of the bill that were attributable to each of those. But we need to know that for municipalization, we need to know it for community choice aggregation, that third way, and then it will help us in dealing with the Excel franchise itself, if that's the option we choose or some variant of that.
Thanks, Macon. Lisa?
Basically, I was just going to pick up on this third point that Macon made, that it's not just franchise with Excel and looking at that in a different light, and it's not just municipalization, but it's this third kind of avenue that, from my perspective, is the most interesting. And looking at something like community choice aggregation, which we can't do in the state of Colorado, which is kind of gives you another view of doing something like Muni Light, Municipal Light, where we partner with somebody who would do distribution and transmission of the energy, and then we as the municipal, we choose what kind of energy choices that we want for our future. And I just wanted to make sure that that wasn't missing from the discussion. And I don't think Xcel is the only game in town. It seems like there's other power companies that we certainly could partner with and would be interested in partnering with us. So I'm going to belabor the point. I think Macon made good points, but I certainly don't want to miss out on that.
So I put myself on the list. I don't know down at that end, Ken again. But let me just say that in addition to Macon's 3, I mean, for me, the one that I found intriguing to me when I looked at the list was the idea of really taking a good look at distributed generation and what the potential was here, because it seems like even within a franchise agreement, our goal is a more clean electrical energy supply, less reliant on coal and possibly even natural gas. And it seems to me, to the extent that we mine our local resources, we could have a franchise agreement with Xcel, but if we were producing 20% of our electricity here, I mean, I know we have all these funny arguments about who has the RECs and who has this and that, but I mean, I think that there is something that could be a fourth option, which is mine absolutely every opportunity we have to produce energy here that's used directly by the citizens in whatever form, and you know, as an option under a franchise agreement. And we do bonding if whatchamacallit proposition doesn't pass. And we look to put solar everywhere. We do geothermal, or we maximize hydro, or we do everything we can do and see how much we could produce locally. So there is some of that data that I know we need. But anyway, that's just one other, and that was on the scenario list.
That would require some significant franchise changes
Yep.
to make the type of difference you're thinking about.
You mean because Xcel would have to underwrite the cost of some of the
Because we could have as much distributed generation as we want, and that's not a bad thing, of course, but, you know, with the current franchise, so what? I mean, we're putting some more distributed energy on the system, but it isn't really changing anything about how it all holds together.
No, it is. To the extent that you're using the energy that's produced on your house, you're not pulling energy off the grid that may be coal-based. And to the extent that you could imagine that many, many people would be able to produce energy either collectively in solar gardens or individually, and use that energy themselves, it definitely does affect the proportion of clean energy rather than. But you know, this is for another day. But I think there is a really fruitful discussion to have about, you know, what are those possibilities?
I guess my question is, if you're gonna aggregate kind of the energy, not just put it on people's houses, you would need some changes in regulations.
Okay,
Because we
fine.
just don't have that authority to do any of that right now.
Fine, but I just was saying that there are probably more than 3 options.
Susan, distributed generation is very, very important, but I see that as an integral part of the planning for either municipalization or the third way. But because of the pace of distributed generation, where you integrate the resources over time, that pushes you out some years. I mean, not, but it may be. I mean, that's one of the. It's so very important. That's where a lot of the economic vitality of keeping the money within the city, the county, and the region.
So we don't need to debate all of this, but from my perspective, I probably have a dozen friends who don't pay any electrical energy bill because they produce enough electricity and they've made their house tight enough that they don't.
Me.
Right.
Yeah, that's Lisa. So I have 11 more
number 11.
friends besides
Yeah.
Lisa. And
Matt.
so, to me, I don't see how you could argue that that's, and Matt. is almost there
Is almost there with.
with producing, not paying much of an electrical bill.
We're zero.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We've been
so
at zero
there are
for 2
two
years.
friends, so I have 10 more besides these two on council. And so I do think that that
So
could be
cool.
separate and apart from either it could either work in a municipalization or be in a franchise, but have everybody in town doing their own energy thing. So anyway, that's just one idea.
to say something.
Yes.
I don't want to, I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. I just wanted to remind you that we will go out of franchise January 1, and one of the things we're working on is life without a franchise. And we're discovering that it may not be that different than life with a franchise. So as you contemplate all of these things, the third way may be life without a franchise, that we do this through the city's police power. And we're not set on our recommendations. We'll be finalizing a memo tomorrow, I think, on this. But there is, so keep that in mind as you have these discussions. From our perspective, there's this other thing that's out there of which we are all going to participate in January 1, 2011, whether we like it or not.
So Ken?
Very briefly, to follow on, yes, great. I think there might be a fourth possibility. It would be easier at the legislature to investigate the city and people in the city keeping the recs, or in other words, not charging the other ratepayers for the recs and rebates. It's not in the law right now, but that might not be so hard. It would be more expensive, but if we municipalize, we'd have to do that anyway. Second, I liked your comments on getting a third party to analyze the R.W. Beck study, because I think there are some big missing elements in it, like they didn't include real estate, and there's some other elements. Somebody who knows that stuff should look at it. And the third thing is, R.W. Beck at the end of their study did some analysis based on a couple of scenarios. It would really be nice if we had a simple tool that we could plug in numbers at some point, just an Excel tool or something where not Excel spelled with an E, spreadsheet, where you could assume costs for the distribution system. If the capital was this much, if it was this much, what happens? A little tool to do that would be awfully helpful.
In fact, if I could just respond, that we were really considering that to be part of this pro forma, although we don't want to make it arbitrarily difficult and hard to use. I think it may be that we want to break it out and create a couple different tools that we can test some assumptions against, but that was absolutely one of the things that we wanted to think about.
Great, thank you.
So any other comments? We'll have lots of time to talk about this, but that was pretty good. It seems like people are kind of on it. So great, Jonathan, thanks. Is there anything else you need from us?
I just want to say thanks. This is a hugely complex process, and as we work through this, it's been incredibly helpful for me and the other staff on the energy team to be able to have the time with council to talk through, particularly at the energy roundtables. So I just thank you for your comments tonight.
Yeah,
We thank you too.
Thank you. Question, are you then going to modify this and get this out to your teams, your different advisory groups to get input? Okay.
Yes. And so this data and analysis piece is a work in progress, and I think it will be for some time. So we've heard some great input tonight on how we need to refine it. And it sounds to me like we probably just need to make sure that each one is labeled draft.
Great. Okay then, thanks.